Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. And Happy New Year to you if we have not spoken since last year, and I think that's probably the case with me. I'm not sure about Don. At any rate, we're delighted to be here. Don, how are you doing today, and what's going on in Oklahoma world?
Well, I'm doing just fine, William. Kind of like you, just up to my eyeballs in work. Somebody, it seemed like I get asked quite often, how does it feel to be retired? And my response is like, do what? What are you talking about? And I very often tell people I'm working harder now than I've ever worked in my ministry in my entire life. And they go, well, you're not. Yeah. They said, well, you're not preaching full time at a pulpit. I said, no, but I don't have to be preaching every Sunday to be working hard. And I'm working hard.
That is so true. It's almost gotten to the point now I go to preach on the Sunday to take a break.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like that for sure. So anyway, my wife asked me today a question about how my morning had went, or asked me some question, I've forgotten exactly what it was, and I told her, I said, I really honestly don't have any idea. I said, I haven't looked up from the computer from the time I got there this morning at 4 o'clock until we actually went to the chiropractor. And I said, I literally haven't looked up. I've been doing writing. I've been trying to get a book finished, this book on the death of Adam, the life of Christ, which is waiting for someone.
I know, that's cute.
I don't know who that might be, but anyway. But I did receive. I've received now 2 review quotes from 2 different men that I appreciate very, very much. Daniel Rogers said he would be finished with the bibliography within the next week or so. So literally, I'm getting very, very close to that, having it ready. And then, of course, the Facebook correspondence. William, you and I have been talking via email and phone and what have you. It's more than a little amusing that you correspond on Facebook, and somebody that you've never heard of before, somebody that has never even posted on your pages before, all of a sudden they jump up, they appear on your page, or they appear on some of the other Facebook pages, and they pose a question to you. And in reality, they pose a question that you and I have both answered literally hundreds of times in the past. But if we don't answer them within their imaginary time frame that they've established in their own mind, that is when it ought to have been answered, all of a sudden they start in, well, it's obvious that Preston can't answer this question. If he could answer this question, he would. He answers everybody else, but he won't answer me because he knows he can't answer this. And their questions sometimes aren't even, I won't say they aren't intelligent, but they're certainly not theologically substantive. And, of course, one of the most common that we hear is, just show us one patristic writer who wrote and said that the day of the Lord was in AD 70. Now, I pointed out to one individual, he's been posting this over and over and over again. And until he posted that question repeatedly a couple of weeks ago, I'd never even heard of him. Don't know his name, don't have his name in my files, claims to be a Bible student, all this kind of stuff. And he kept posting. Well, other people chimed in and answered his questions. He wouldn't accept answers from anyone but me. And, says, Don Preston, you've got to answer this question. Well, there's only about 20 other people ahead of him in line saying, you've got to answer my question. You've got to answer my question. And so I finally gave him the quote from Josephus about the armies and the chariots in the sky over Jerusalem, over the temple, with the voice from heaven saying, let us depart hence. Well, that didn't satisfy him. He has a totally misguided hermeneutic. Well, it doesn't say they saw Jesus. And Josephus was a Jew. And on and on and on. Every excuse in the world was given for not accepting the testimony of Josephus. And as I've said many, many times, I don't believe Josephus was inspired. But I don't think, on the other hand of that you could just summarily dismiss his testimony. So he kept after it. And finally, I decided to give him a biblical answer today. And I pointed out, look, the biblical definition of the day of the Lord is when God used one nation to destroy another nation. And when he used those other nations to judge another nation, it was said that he came on the clouds, he came in flaming fire, he came with a shout. Yet nobody saw him literally, visibly, bodily coming. This is the definition of the day of the Lord. And Jesus said he was going to come as the Father had come. And I added some additional comments. Well, he writes back and he said, well, if what you're saying is true, then why did you even give me the quote from Josephus? You've contradicted yourself. And I'm writing back, I did not contradict myself. You asked for a secular citation. I gave you one. Then I gave you the actual biblical definition of the day of the Lord. And I said, let me drive that home. In Matthew 24, verse 30, Jesus said, concerning the fall of Jerusalem, then they shall see the sign of the Son of Man in the heavens. And I said, the force of the Greek there, as is proven by any number of Greek scholars, is that the visible events of the fall of Jerusalem would prove that the Lord was present. His parousia would be the reality. It would be the invisible reality manifested by the visible events. So he ignores all of that again and says, well, you gave me Josephus as proof of a visible coming. It's like, good grief. So this is the kind of stuff, and I will give him credit for this. He has been far more gracious, far more kind, far more courteous than most of the other posters. Most of the other posters who are detractors, as you well know, William, they simply come on there. They're blasting with both barrels. Preston and Bell are heretics of the first sort. They're doomed to hell. May the Lord strike them dead, blah, 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 blah. This guy has not been like that. So at least I give him credit for that. But, I mean, that's what I've been going back and doing for the last 2 weeks since we haven't had our programs for the last 2 weeks, and I haven't been filming for the last 2 weeks. And to a great extent, I haven't even been on Facebook, or certainly haven't done anything on YouTube. And so it seems apparent that an awful lot of these guys have taken advantage of the fact that I haven't been on YouTube, I haven't been on Facebook, and so they've taken advantage of my absence and said, well, Preston won't answer. Preston won't answer. Where's Preston? You know, he's running from us. When, you know, whole point of fact is, I told him in my YouTube video, posted on Facebook, I wasn't going to be on Facebook all that much. I may or may not respond to other people, but they're looking for bragging rights. That's all the world are doing.
Yeah.
And if that's what they need, that's fine.
Yeah. Where's that thing? Way over there. Sorry about that. Hold on.
I don't know what that was in William's background, but evidently he's taking care of that, and he'll be back with us here momentarily. I don't know whether that was a phone or just exactly what that was. But anyway, folks, that's what takes up an awful lot of my time, trying to engage people who believe that they have honest objections to covenant eschatology. And in many instances, I'll be very, very honest. In many instances, the individuals that I am interacting with are rude, crude, arrogant, caustic. They're people that I would just as soon not interact with. However, in some instances, they claim that they were preterists, and they now claim that they've got the answers to preterism, that they are God's gift to the world to refute covenant eschatology. Well, one of those individuals, just recently, for instance, posted on Facebook, what would it mean if we could prove that Revelation was written after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70? Well, several people chimed in and said, well, it would prove that preterism is false, et cetera, et cetera. I addressed him and I said, I would be more than happy to debate you on the subject of the dating of the book of Revelation. He has now given every excuse in the world for not debating me on that subject, even though he knows, has argued in the past, that if you prove Revelation was written after AD 70 and applied to something other than AD 70, you falsified covenant eschatology. So, even though that's been his premise, yesterday he actually posted the dating of Revelation is actually irrelevant. And I posted back in response, I said, you're the one that laid out the issue of the dating of Revelation. And I said, what's amazing to me is that in virtually every single in-depth conversation I've had, debate conversations I've had, public or private, the people I've interacted with have claimed sooner or later that if the book of Revelation was written after AD 70, then covenant eschatology is refuted. And yet you now come along and you tell us that the late date of Revelation is totally irrelevant to the discussion. Why did you bring it up in the first place? I mean, that's the kind of people we have to deal with.
Yeah, it was probably before he really studied and investigated it, and once he found out that it was written before 70 AD, he decided to drop the issue.
Well, he claims to have been a preterist for a while, but then abandoned it. Look, his reasons for abandoning covenant eschatology are some of the most facile, they're really, really pathetic arguments. And, William, as you know, I sent you an article that I've written as an introductory article in response to this young man. He did what is supposedly an exegesis of Romans chapter 8. And, of course, his position is that all creation, and by creation he means, as I'm fond of saying, bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes. He believes that physical creation will one day be redeemed from its current futility. Now, in his article, he didn't share with us what the futility of creation is. He didn't tell us if rocks are too hard. He didn't tell us if trees are too short. He didn't tell us what the futility of creation is. He just simply said creation will one day be redeemed from its futility that came about as a result of sin. So what I pointed out, and folks, I'll be posting this article in the very near future. It'll be on my websites. It'll be in a 2-part series. What I point out is that this young man, in his supposed exegesis of Romans chapter 8, 18 and following, starts with verse 18. But Paul's discussion doesn't start with verse 18. It starts with verse 17. And this young man did not so much as mention verse 17. Not even, doesn't even mention it. Not one reference to it. And yet, the very first word of Romans 8:18 directly connects verse 18 and following with verse 17. So my question is, how can you claim to have done an in-depth exegesis, a substantive exegesis of Romans 8:18 and following, when you ignore the preliminary context-setting discussion of verse 17? That's not exegesis. That's ignoring the context. So, again, that's the kind of thing that we are dealing with these days of individuals who jump up, who claim that they are God's gift to the world of theology, who claim that they've got all the answers, and yet when you honestly pin them down, when you just reveal the utter illogic of everything that they're saying, with this young man, for instance, his response is to use expletives. He has used some of the rudest, crudest, vulgarest language imaginable, and yet, of course, he's the Christian. Preston is not a Christian because of his views on eschatology. But it's okay for him to use the most vulgar street language imaginable in describing me. So it's just, it's really amazing. It's sad. It's frustrating. It's disturbing when you have to deal with that kind of, well, for lack of better terminology, when you have to deal with that kind of nonsense day after day after day after day of those who claim that they understand Scripture, and yet their logic is so flawed, so fundamentally, foundationally flawed, that it's not even close to correct. And it cannot be correct. And when you demonstrate it to be wrong, once again, all you get is the vulgarities thrown back at you. It's frustrating at times. And yet, the reason we do it, William does it, I do it, others do it. The reason we do it is not because we believe that we're going to change the mind of those individuals, but because we're very aware of the fact that there are lots and lots of folks who are auditing. They sit back, they do not comment publicly. And yet I hear from them repeatedly, privately, telling me how much they appreciate the efforts that we put into responding to that kind of post and answering those objections. So we keep on doing it. We take the abuse and, we just let it ride.
Absolutely. I was sitting here thinking as you were going through that about, some experiences I've had. Of course, I've been, just dog-tired with busy work, trying to work on a couple of houses here and there, and that's been keeping me very busy. But in the meantime, I've been working with this young man who is from the Hebrew Israelite community, and he's come to understand covenant eschatology and pretty much, takes them to task almost every single day, if not 2 or 3 times a day, and challenging them to debate. They are now running from him, but he's beginning to make some inroads there. And, we have a class started on Monday night that we do on Zoom, and we have several coming on, and I'm having several feedback, several follow-up conversations with people who are gaining and learning, and some of them have been thoroughly convinced. We have a few other men around the country, some in New York and some in California and maybe in Florida who are now embracing it, even some ladies on the line that are doing, that are coming to an understanding. But in the meantime, something interesting happened, and that was a conversation with a couple of gentlemen from a congregation where I used to preach in Memphis. They happened to call us. Actually, they had been watching Elvin's videos, and having watched his videos, they saw some things that they thought they wanted to speak to him about, and said they had some, might be having some problems with, some doctrine. Well, the only thing he had been talking about was eschatology, showing them that the Bible, all prophecy was fulfilled, et cetera. So, that's what he thought we were going to have a conversation about. So we ended up, to make the long story short, ended up having a study with these gentlemen at their congregation, at least at a room in their congregation. We didn't find out until later that it may or may not have been sponsored. I guess it wasn't sponsored by the leadership of the congregation, but this guy was the minister, and so he's the current minister there, along with the other one, and both of them are former students at the Memphis School of Preaching, and we did get permission from them to record on video the meeting, which we did the entire meeting. We recorded it, and after we finished the meeting, everybody was in agreement that we were going to have follow-up studies. As a matter of fact, we left on a very high cordial note. Even as we walked out to the parking lot, we shook hands again, asked for permission to bring other people who wanted to come and, just listen. And they said, yeah, we possibly will make this a big thing and maybe even a public debate. Well, I think they walked back into their building and asked some of the people who I was. And some of the people who remembered that I used to preach at that congregation, probably gave them an earful of, of me and, what I taught. And then before we could get home good, we had received another phone call that they were no longer interested in having a discussion. Now, the discussion went very orderly. It was very, cordial between us, et cetera. We exchanged our positions. And everybody stood for what they believed. There was no problem there, and no one, got caustic with each other or anything. So, there was nothing. And even as we talked about it later, the preacher said, I have nothing to hide. So he felt confident with what his view was. But I posted the video unlisted. In other words, it's not public because I wanted to share it with a few people. And man, when they found out the video was online, they just all the seams burst from their britches, and it's been quite an ordeal. Now I'm in the process of writing them a response because I've had two conflicting messages from each of them. One saying, they're okay with the video as long as there are some disclaimers there. The other one just doesn't want it there at all, and felt like it's an embarrassment to the East Haven, church in Memphis where I used to preach. And, one of their complaints was, of course, that it's a public, it's put on a public channel. Well, they wrote a letter disfellowshipping me and read it before the entire congregation, visitors present, some years ago, and didn't ask me my opinion of whether I thought it should be distributed. And even done as we go to various debates, as you know, and I've shared with you, I think I was in Pensacola at the time Holger was debating Howard Denham, or was that in, yeah, I think it's Pensacola. But at any rate, he was there, and Howard Denham spent about 10 minutes of his affirmative talking about you and talking about me and referring to that letter. So, that letter is still out there circulating, or at least the influence of it and people's knowledge of it is still being used. We go to these guys' meetings like South Haven, and they call our names from the pulpit. Even the Memphis School of Preaching, when they're doing their studies, they are calling my name. I know they've called my name. I'm sure they've called yours too, but I've watched a video where Keith Mosier referred to me in his teaching on 2 Peter 3, which was horrible, by the way, in terms of the position that he was taking. But at the same time, and they seem to have a problem that we would post a video that allows us to show both sides of an issue. Now, in none of those areas that I've just mentioned did they give us the opportunity to respond. As a matter of fact, when I was having a conversation on the way out the door for lunch, they interrupted that and became almost hostile because they didn't even want a conversation, a private conversation with a person who was, a well-known scholarly teacher to even engage in questions. And yet, here we are sitting down having a back-and-forth conversation, very, very cordial, and they have problems with that being online. So those are just some of the things that I've been going through. I haven't, said anything to, a lot of people about it. It's out there. But I'm writing them a response, based on some things that, that we have said. And I just think it's rather interesting that since we are called the heretics and we are considered to be the ones who are teaching false doctrine, they have a problem with having open conversations about their own views, and yet they're always claiming that they can refute what we say. So I find it, just very, very ironic.
Well, it is ironic, and as you well know, it happens over and over and over again. And for those not familiar with the churches of Christ, it might be helpful to know that historically in the churches of Christ, the boast has been made that, quote, we will debate anyone on any subject. And if we are wrong, all you have to do is show us where we are wrong. But we will debate the truth of God's word any day. And William and I have said this from pulpits. We have said this privately. We have said it online. If William and I were teaching premillennialism, if we were espousing the dispensational premillennial doctrine right now, I can guarantee you that leaders in the churches of Christ would be lined up metaphorically, and they'd be stumbling all over themselves, fighting each other for the opportunity to be the ones to debate us. But when it comes to covenant eschatology, they, as William has indicated, they do not want the public and they do not want the membership of the churches of Christ to hear anything about what we are saying. They know very well the power of the message of covenant eschatology. They know very well that when people hear what we are presenting, that it has that sound, that ring of truth, and that people become convinced of it. And so they take the course, as William just described, of condemning any release of any video showing both sides, no matter how cordial it was, no matter the fact that the preacher said, hey, I don't have a problem with what I believe. There it is. And don't have a problem with it being released on the internet. But no, that's not the way that Memphis School of Preaching, that's not the way that so many leaders within the churches of Christ think. They do not want any exposure given to this message. And I have been told, William, as you well know, and you've been told as well, when we would challenge given leaders in the churches of Christ to meet us in formal public debate, their response has been, I'm not going to give you a forum for your message. I'm not going to give you an audience for your message. Well, there's two things to be observed in this. Number one, every time we've actually had a debate with members of the churches of Christ, they adamantly refused to promote it. They did not advertise it. When we have asked them, did you promote and advertise this? Oh, well, we ran one little ad in one Brotherhood paper. And yet, those of us on this side of the aisle promoted it extensively on the internet in as many venues as we could find, but they didn't want their people there. But the second thing, when they say, we're not going to give you guys an audience, we're not going to give you an opportunity to spread your error, But to go back, if we were teaching premillennialism, they would be lined up to debate us. Why? Because they believe that in a formal public debate, they can refute dispensationalism. But there is a deep-seated awareness, fear on their part, now based upon the fact that we've had some debates with some of them. They realize their views don't stand up well in public debate. Their traditional views do not stand the test of public debate. And so what they do, if they get in a public debate, they try every debate trick in the book. And that was openly manifested.
Even to the point of not shaving or something like that?
Yeah, something like that. That's a private joke, folks, but it actually happened. My last debate opponent showed up here in Ardmore, unshaven, unkept, unwashed, if you please, and bragged about it later, thinking that really shook me up. He thought that threw me off of my game. And, of course, as I told William and others, if he's naive enough to think that he's going to throw me off my game by not shaving, he doesn't know me very well. He certainly doesn't know what I'm like. And it was such an immature, childish trick. But he tried a lot of little tricks like that. And so that's what we found, folks, is they tried to use debate tricks, just like Howard Denham debating Holger Neubauer. One debate trick after another. He told a absolute blatant, purposeful lie about me from the pulpit. And Holger, thankfully, didn't allow that to sidetrack him too long, but he did take time to address it, and properly so to a certain extent. But I sent an email to some people who were there, including Steve Bazin, and I said, this needs to be read, and it needs to be known that Howard Denham told a blatant false lie about me from the pulpit during that debate. He needs to be accosted over that. He needs to be confronted with that lie. He was, but he never apologized. Not one word. He completely, totally ignored the fact that he had been caught in a public lie. Not one word of apology. So it's incredible. Well, anyway, William, we could keep on. We've taken half the show here to talk about, to tell anecdotes and stories and what have you. There's a lot of news to be caught up on, and things going on literally all over the world. We're getting maybe just a tiny bit closer for a trip to India next year, possibly in November. And as I have mentioned on this program, Lord willing, nothing happens and the money allows, my wife and I will be traveling to Israel in one part of the year next year. I'm just so excited about that. It will be a once-in-a-lifetime trip. Well, the trip to India will be as well, for that matter. But, I mean, there's some truly, truly exciting things going on in the movement of covenant eschatology. It's just absolutely amazing. But we have been studying the doctrine of the Messianic Temple. We have spent a good bit of time focused on Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. And when William wasn't here, I guess maybe that was the last program that we did, I got all the way down through Isaiah chapter 3, and I touched on Isaiah chapter 3, verse 25, and I want to touch on it once again because it's so critical for us to understand the context. The key to understanding the Bible is context, context, context. And what happens when people go to Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, historically, for instance, in the all-millennial world, they'll go to Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2 and 3. It shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the mountains and exalted above the hills. See, that's talking about the establishment of the church on the day of Pentecost. They run to 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15 to identify the temple of God with the house of God, the church of the Lord, etc. And they say, see, that's the fulfillment of Isaiah. But then they completely and totally ignore the fact that Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 is one united, indivisible discourse. It doesn't stop at Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3 at all. It is, again, a harmonious, unbroken, united discourse about the events of the last days to be consummated at the day of the Lord. Now, we've talked about the day of the Lord before, so we won't go back over that territory now. But in chapter 3, over and over and over again, we are given very precise, very irrefutable, very powerful evidence that this last days period is about a time of judgment on Jerusalem and Judah. It just says that over and over again. And I never will forget, William, I mean, it's probably been 25, maybe 30 years ago when I stumbled upon the significance of Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 as a united prophecy. I remember reading, and I want to give proper credit here because I believe in giving credit to whom credit is due. I was reading a really short article by Charles Geiser. Charles Geiser. I don't remember the name of the article. I do not remember the publication. It might have been Kingdom Council for all I know. I mean, but this is a long time ago. And Charles Geiser, who's still alive today, as far as I know, mentioned Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 and just made a couple of really brief comments on it. And I want to tell you, my theological radar ears perked right up. I laid the article aside. I went right straight to Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. I read the entire narrative without a break, without stopping. And it was one of those, oh my goodness moments. I was absolutely blown away. I was blown away by the fact, number one, that I had never seen it, and so I was appalled at my ignorance. I was blown away by the fact that I had never in all of my life, being raised in the churches of Christ, heard anyone even remotely suggest that we examine the entire 3 chapters as a united discourse. I was blown away, thirdly, by the power of what Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 actually say. I mean, over and over and over again, I saw references to the famine in those last days, to the famine in Jerusalem, taking away the bread and the staff from Judah and Jerusalem, in the time when the Lord would rise to judge his people, and he would judge the elders among his people. And then, and William, you know that one of my passions is correlating Old Testament prophecies with New Testament fulfillment and finding in the New Testament echoes and references to Old Testament passages that I had never known before or that are seldom developed in the commentaries. That has been for years and continues to be a real driving passion with me to understand the Old Testament and the New Testament use of that Old Testament, the New Testament application. There is a verse right here in Isaiah chapter 3 that jumped off the page at me, and it jumped off the page at me not because the New Testament writer specifically says this will be the time when Isaiah 3 is fulfilled. No. Not because Jesus himself said this time will be when Isaiah is fulfilled, but because Jesus uses the language of Isaiah chapter 3, and he does say this in describing the fall of Jerusalem. He says in Luke 21, verse 22, "These be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled." So we've got that without any doubt whatsoever, which is so incredibly, incredibly important. But now look at Isaiah chapter 3 and remember, Isaiah chapter 3 tells us over and over and over again, the Lord of hosts will take away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread, and the whole stay of water. This is about Jerusalem and Judah. Verse 5, the people will be oppressed, everyone by another, everyone by his neighbor. The child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient, and the base against the honorable. And, everywhere you read in Isaiah chapter 3, it is a picture of famine, it is a picture of peril, it is a picture of warfare, it is a picture of horror. Now look at Isaiah 3, verse 25. Your men, who's he addressing? Judah and Jerusalem. Your men shall fall by the edge of the sword, and your mighty men in... Now, the King James says, in the war, but that's not the correct translation. It is in the battle, or in the conflict, if you want to use that term. In Luke 21, after Jesus had just said that the fall of Jerusalem was going to be the time of the fulfillment of all things, notice what he says in verse 23, woe to those who are with child, to those who give suck in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. All you got to do is read Isaiah chapter 3 to see that this prediction in Isaiah chapter 3 is a prediction of wrath on the people of Israel. You go back to Isaiah chapter 2, verses 9 through 21. It's the great day of the Lord's wrath. So here is Jesus in Luke 21, verse 22 and 23, talking about the time when all prophecy would be fulfilled, the time of wrath on Jerusalem, wrath on Jerusalem, wrath on the people. Verse 24, and they who? Those of Jerusalem and Judah shall fall by the edge of the sword. They shall be led away captive into all nations. Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Folks, I'm telling you, here is Jesus doing everything except saying, oh, Isaiah 3 will be fulfilled at that time. Well, they didn't have chapter divisions back then when Jesus was talking, but as any number of commentators, men such as N.T. Wright, Richard Hayes, you name almost any of your major New Testament Jesus scholars of the day, they will tell you that what the New Testament writers did, they would quote only a part of a passage. They would quote part of a prophecy. They would use just a few key words. And to the Jewish reader, to the Jewish listener, automatically key them in what the speaker, what the writer was referring to. Let's not forget neither Jesus or his apostles spoke or wrote in a theological vacuum. They spoke and wrote firmly within the matrix of their understanding, their knowledge, and their application of Old Testament prophecy. I mean, over and over again. You know, Jesus said, don't think that I came to destroy the law of the prophets. I didn't come to destroy, but to fulfill. Okay? So what was Jesus' ministry and message about? Fulfillment of the law of the prophets. Peter said his doctrine of the restoration of all things would be in fulfillment of what all of the prophets, yea, all who have ever written, said would come to pass. Acts 3, 21 to 24. Likewise, Peter said in 2 Peter chapter 3 that his doctrine of the day of the Lord and the new heaven and new earth was taken from the Old Covenant prophets, taken from the words of Jesus, taken from the words of the other apostles. On and on it goes, folks. Every New Testament writer, almost, lets us know that their eschatological hope was nothing but the hope of Israel found in Moses, the law, and the prophets. Read Acts chapter 24, 14 and 15. So when we find Jesus in Luke chapter 21, speaking of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, and by the way, even the dispensationalists agree with that. Thomas Ice says that when Jesus predicted that AD 70 would be the fulfillment of the days of vengeance, all things that are written, that he was not talking about a partial fulfillment. He was talking about the absolute total fulfillment of all things concerning vengeance on Israel that was in the prophets. And you ought to read the list of prophecies that Thomas Ice says were fulfilled in AD 70. To state the case in a humongous understatement, Thomas Ice gave away the whole farm in his admission that Luke 21:22 was AD 70. Well, if Luke 21:22 is AD 70, guess what? Luke 21:23 is AD 70, and Luke 21:24 is AD 70. But where's Luke 21 drawing from? It's drawing from the prophecies of the last days and the judgment on Judah and Jerusalem when the men of Israel would fall by the edge of the sword. That's Isaiah 3:25. Well, it's Isaiah 2 through 4. But let's not forget, let's bring this back full circle here. Let's not forget that our discussion is the Messianic Temple. And what's so significant about this is that in Isaiah chapter 2 through 4, even though the destruction of the temple is not specifically and explicitly stated, the judgment on Jerusalem is. Well, if you're going to destroy Jerusalem, what are you going to do for the temple? What are you going to do to the temple? So this is inferred. It's implied. But what would come in those last days of the judgment on Judah and Jerusalem? What would come? The Messianic Temple. The Old Covenant Temple would be swept away, manifesting the New Covenant Temple, which is a spiritual reality, not a physical reality. Which brings me back to remind everyone, I have said repeatedly on this program, I would dearly love to be able to debate Dr. Michael Brown on whether or not there is in our future the building of a future Messianic temple, or whether there's even going to be the building of a man of sin temple in Jerusalem. I'd dearly love to debate him on that. And he knows I'd love to debate him on that. But Michael Brown has now gone on record basically saying he's not going to debate a full preterist again. He had a debate with Michael Sullivan not too long ago, and Michael did a very good job, especially for his very first debate. He did a very fine job. And so, as a result of my two debates with him, as a result of his debate with Michael Sullivan, Dr. Michael Brown has now decided he will no longer debate any full preterist. And yet he'll debate atheists, he will debate homosexuals, he will debate Arminians, and Calvinists. He'll debate virtually anybody on any subject. He just won't debate a full preterist again. That is what you call disingenuous. But back to the point. I hope everyone can see the power of this. Here in Isaiah chapter 3, remember our discussion is about the Messianic Temple. Isaiah has not abandoned that. That is to say, he has not abandoned the framework of the last days. And the events of the last days, well, what are the events of the last days? The establishment of the Messianic Temple. But in order to establish the Messianic Temple, what was going to happen to the old temple? Well, your men shall fall by the edge of the sword. Jesus said Israel's men, Judah and Jerusalem's men, would fall by the edge of the sword. When? At the destruction of the old temple. And so here we have all of these motifs, all of these concepts that are directly parallel with one another. Jesus is a little more specific and explicit in Luke perhaps, but he's very clearly drawing on Isaiah chapter 3. And that means, without any doubt whatsoever, that the Messianic temple had to be, quote, constructed, unquote, in the days prior to and leading up to consummating in the fall of Jerusalem and the Old Covenant temple in AD 70. And, you know, William, it just astounds me at the theological gymnastics, the verbal gymnastics that some people go to in trying to avoid the testimony of Isaiah chapter 3. It's literally staggering to see people. I mean, most of the time when I try to point out these parallels, these connections, these correlations, well, that's just your imagination at work. There's no correlation there. Jesus didn't say Isaiah was going to be fulfilled. And it gets back to something we have emphasized and we continue to emphasize on this program, folks. If we have an improper hermeneutic, our theology will be flawed. Our doctrine will be false. It's just like I mentioned at the beginning of the program as we were sharing some of these anecdotes. This young man wrote a very lengthy article supposedly refuting an article on Romans 11, 25 to 27. Actually, it'll be a seven-part installment, and you can read the first 6 installments on my website, donkpreston.com. But he wrote this real lengthy refutation, the bulk of which was focused on Romans chapter 8, trying to prove, as I said, with a little bit of levity at the beginning of the program, he believes that bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes have got to be redeemed from their futility. And yet, once again, to reiterate, if you didn't hear it, you need to hear it. He did not say one single word, did not hit a keystroke to mention Romans 8:17 and its relationship to Romans 8:18 and following. And yet Romans 8:18 begins with the connective particle for, Greek word gar, which directly and inseparably connects Romans 8:18 with verse 17. He ignored it. It's as if it did not or does not exist. So I ask again what I asked at the very beginning of the program as I related these things. How can you claim that you have done a proper, definitive, and substantive exegesis of any text, doesn't matter what that text is, when you completely and totally divorce it from its proper context. Now, I suppose, and if I were a betting man, I would almost bet on this, that when I begin posting this article, he's going to come back and say, no, I didn't say anything about verse 17 because I didn't intend to. Well, that's an admission that you didn't intend to establish the context of your discussion. You just jumped right in there, making all of these claims that are totally unrelated to the actual context of Romans 8:18. That will be the entire point. What is the context? That's what we have to ask in any discussion of the Messianic Temple. What is the context of the prediction of the establishment of the mountain of the Lord's house, the Messianic Temple? What's the context? Well, Isaiah 2-4 is the context. What is that context? What that context is, your men shall fall by the edge of the sword at the time of the conflict. Well, what conflict was in the last days? The New Testament writers identified the generation, the time in which they were living, as the last days. That means that was the time for the fulfillment of Isaiah chapters 2-4. And as we pointed out before, if you're going to claim that we're in the last days, that the last days of the Christian age, and at the same time you're going to say that God was through with Israel at the cross, okay, if God was through with Israel at the cross, then why in the world is Isaiah 2-4 speaking about the last days, which ostensibly is the Christian age according to the objectors? Okay, so at the last days of the Christian age, and God was through with Israel at the cross before the last days ever began, then why in the world is Isaiah 2-4 focused on what would happen to Israel, Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, at the time of the judgment of Old Covenant Jerusalem in the last days? Wasn't God already through with Israel? Folks, this is problematic. This is hugely problematic for the traditional views of the last days, for the traditional views, in many ways, of the Messianic Temple, and certainly the place of Israel in God's scheme of redemption. You can't cut Israel off at the cross and yet have God focused on Israel and her fate in the last days after the cross. Her last days should have ended at the cross, according to that paradigm. These are some of the reasons that I abandoned that traditional amillennial view years and years and years ago, because these passages, these prophecies, simply do not allow the identification of the church age as the Christian age. Doesn't work. And it does not allow the view that God was through with Israel at the cross. And it demands that the nature of the Messianic Temple is, in fact, spiritual and not physical. Because after all, if the last days were the last days of Israel, and if, as we have established on this program repeatedly, if the last days of Israel ended in AD 70, okay, so the Messianic Temple had to be established in the last days of Israel. Israel's last days ended in AD 70. That demands that the Messianic Temple was established prior to AD 70. I mean, folks, that's just pretty definitive. I mean, how's anybody going to deal with that? Well, they may deal with that by more foaming, obfuscation, evasion, name-calling, but it won't do any good. The facts are still there. And William, it appears to me that we are out of time. I think it's time for you to get some rest, my friend. You have been running, and, somebody asked me the other day how many days a week I work. I said I work 10 days a week, and I know that you do as well. So, time to get some rest, my friend. And I want to thank everyone for joining us on this evening's program here on Two Guys and a Bible on on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. With that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.